But China, by golly, China's still on board. September 15th, 2020. This is a special all-China edition of BNC. The question is, how should the United States frame its relationship with China, given what we know and what we've been learning of late? And we'll look at several aspects of this. We'll look at Xi declaring himself president for life. We'll look at the treatment of the Uyghurs. We'll look at the situation with Hong Kong. We'll look at the Nike NBA China nexus. We'll look at China's having a say-so in the making of Hollywood movies. We'll look at China insinuating itself into the Middle East, which is an interesting region of the world right now. There's some good and bad developments. I just wrote a blog post late in the day about this the other day. And that's where I got to really think about China's role in this. What their Belt and Road Initiative is giving them a real presence in the Middle East. And then their disregard of the Paris Climate Accord's goal of phasing out coal-fired power plants, which whichever side you're on of the whole climate issue, they're supposed to be getting with the program, and they're not. Anyway, so those are the aspects that we're going to look at. Yeah.
We've always talked about, when we're doing a show and we run across a topic, like, oh man, this would make a great episode for just doing a whole show on whatever topic, and we're finally doing it. We talked last time, we need to have just a whole show on China, and now we're having that show. So you're welcome.
Yeah. Okay. Well, my day job, I'm a freelance journalist, a freelance writer, and there's a quarterly business magazine that is published in our city. It's a smallish city, but it punches above its weight economically. We've got several big players here. It's a very internationally connected city on the economic level, and this has been the case for a long time. And this quarterly business magazine, I've written for it for many years, and I usually get assignments from my editor. But one time I pitched an article idea, and they went for it. And this was about 10 years ago, before there was much public acknowledgement of what hasn't ever changed about China since 1949, and there's a lot of good feeling about all the joint ventures and trade and exchange of ideas, and students going to Chinese students going to American universities and vice versa, and everybody was pretty excited. My idea that I asked my editor, I wanted to talk to some people about, is there any downside to all this exciting activity? And I talked to the economic development director here in our city, and I talked to some people from various companies of various sizes. I was displeased with the way the article came out. I never got anybody to really answer my questions, and that was a very frustrating experience. But it got me thinking more and more about this matter. And then, of course, in recent times, there's been a lot of developments. We ought to just kind of retrace the broad historical perspective. China, of course, went communist. Well, the nationalists were kicked out and regrouped on the island of Taiwan, and that's still an issue. The mainland considers it that it's part of China, but the mainland, Mao Zedong and his communists completed their revolution in 1949. They acquired they had their great leap forward in the late 50s and early 60s, which caused mass starvation. Then they acquired a nuclear weapon arsenal in 1964, and then they had the Cultural Revolution, where people weren't sufficiently woke. They weren't getting with the program like Mao thought they should, and so he encouraged bands of young revolutionaries to really just kind of run rampant through all kinds of institutions, the universities and industrial enterprises and government institutions and so forth, and purge them of intellectuals and artists and people who might be thinking wayward thoughts and making trouble and so forth. And a lot of those types were sent out to the countryside to work in fields and stuff like that.
It's kind of the opposite of our woke moment, where we're, basically forcing everyone to be artists and
yeah,
poets
really,
and stuff.
yeah, kind of a mirror opposite. And then came the Nixon's historic 1972 visit to China, which Henry Kissinger had laid the groundwork for that. He'd taken a few trips in the previous year or two to lay the groundwork for that, in the big historic state dinner between Nixon and Mao, and that kicked off our modern relationship with China. And by the end of the 70s, a lot of American companies were doing deals with China, setting up plants over there, forming joint ventures and so forth. And all of that was pretty exciting. There was a little dip in the enthusiasm in 1989 when there was at least as much of an uprising as they could put together in China. And the Tiananmen Square was kind of the center of the real hotspot of that. And a lot of young people were killed and imprisoned and so forth. We kind of, throughout the 90s, we went back and we were starting to just kind of set that aside and do more deals, and there was a lot of cross-fertilization, and that continued until fairly recently. I use another personal anecdote. I used to drive Uber, and the largest campus of our largest state university is in a community about 40 miles from here, and it was good Uber business because on Saturday afternoons in the fall, there are football games or wine festivals or concerts and that kind of thing were real good business. But even on just a regular day, a lot of people just needed carting from the shopping center to their dorm to some classroom building or the library or something like that. And I would say a good 60% of my business was with folks who were students at the School of Business. And I would say a good 60 to 70% of them were from China. Mm-hmm. I found that very interesting. Anyway, but we're starting to get a sense that all is not just coming up roses. China is quickly building the world's largest navy. Its neighbors, such as Vietnam and the Philippines and Australia, are not at all pleased with the way it's bulking up its presence in the South China Sea and the South Pacific generally. A couple of years ago, President Xi, who came up, he started out on the local level through the Communist Party apparatus, and then the regional level, and then the national level, and he declared himself president for life a couple of years ago.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Yeah, let's talk about that sort of era of progress in the 90s and such. I think it was around that time, after Mao, they had, I don't know if it was directly after that, but sometime after that, they changed the law where they would have two-term leaders, basically.
Yeah.
So between Mao and now,
yeah,
they've had sort of a term limit situation with their top leadership. Yeah. So that ended a couple years ago, and it stirs a lot of unrest in the United States and the rest of the Western world, because that seems to be the earmark of totalitarianism. Is a dictator for life, basically. But it was funny. I heard that same sentiment coming from some professors in the UK, and it's like, you guys still have a monarchy, so
yeah.
Whatever.
And one more anecdote. One of the large multinational corporations in our community, a couple years ago, our local paper had me cover its annual shareholders meeting, and there was a Q&A after everybody spoke, and the CEO was asked, you at all skittish about what's going on in China? And he said, it's such a huge market, you cannot pass up that opportunity. He said, I'm not sure we'd continue to exist as a standalone company if we didn't involve ourselves in the Chinese market.
Absolutely, and I think that's absolutely correct. And the question that we're posing here in this show is, how should the United States and maybe the West at large, how should we approach our relationship with China, knowing that in some ways our worlds are going to be intertwined, even if our cultures and our economics are not. But they probably will be to some degree anyway. So how should we frame that going forward? And the naming of the self-proclamation of Xi Jinping as, leader for life, or until he decides to step down, I gotta say that definitely makes the pit in my stomach turn as well.
It's a strong signal.
Because I don't see what the gain is for the Chinese people, because they have something approaching a parliamentary style Congress. I don't know the exact structure of it, but it's something like that. And of course, they have one party rule.
Yeah.
So they have a single party Congress that voted to make this happen. So my question is, well, what would their incentive be to do this? If I'm, a Chinese legislator, assuming that everything's on the level, it's probably not. Who knows what's going on, but assuming everything is truly on the level, what's my incentive for voting to keep him in power for life? How does China get better because of that? And I don't see the argument for that necessarily. So I'm thinking that they must have been promised something pretty good or pretty bad.
The old quip that went around about the Soviet Politburo during Stalin's rule. Don't be, after he gives a speech, don't be or make sure you're the last one clapping.
Yeah. But that ensured a long round of applause at the end.
Yeah, and so that may be, that kind of thing may be an element. But in the last few years, you've seen more and more stories about how the Chinese have, and IT guy like you probably knows about this. They've built an almost perfectly walled-in internet that, and they employ sensors that look for people using forbidden apps and that kind of thing. And if you're caught, you can't make doctor's appointments or travel, or they'll block you from buying a train ticket or a plane ticket. They even codified this so far as to have a system of social credit, and you'd better have good social credit in order to be able to travel or conduct an independent business or that kind of thing. And so we started to see these signs, and then it really became obvious when Xi declared himself president for life. What you were talking about, the national legislature or assembly or whatever, this is always the case in communist regimes. There are two layers or there are two concurrent systems going on. There's the party and then the government, which amount to the same thing, but they set up government bodies and institutions and programs and things to give a democratic, if you will, face to what the Communist Party is doing.
Yeah. The people per se, they don't have a say in electing that Congress. Right. They don't have a say in electing the governors of their state equivalents, right? They have these regions throughout China, and they have these regional governors, but the people don't elect those like we elect our state governors. They don't elect the members of the Congress. Those are appointed by the party. So they have this like pseudo democratic Congress, but it's not democratic in the sense that the people are consulted on who rules them.
Yeah.
And now even less so with this guy in there for life.
Yeah. I think probably that there's so much going on. Well, that quasi-religious movement called Falun Gong, that's when we started to really see a lot of the nature of Chinese persecution. The Falun Gong people were, they're meetings were busted up and people were hauled off to jail, and Christians too. There's a lot of well-documented persecution of Christians, but the most egregious in recent times persecution of a group is a group called the Uighurs that live in the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region in northwest China, and they're one of China's 55 officially recognized ethnic minorities. They're Muslim, and they have their own distinct language and customs and norms and that kind of thing.
I was reading about this a little bit, and what I read was mostly that being a Uyghur doesn't necessarily mean that someone's a Muslim, but that like 90% of them or higher are.
Yeah, and they're mostly Sunni. Anyway, in recent times, the central Chinese government has gone in there and set up concentration camps to try to the same thing they've been pulling with Tibet since they took Tibet over, to try to dismantle traditional Uyghur culture and force them to speak Mandarin and immerse them in indoctrination sessions, bust up families, and then sometimes this is going to sound really awful, but send in males of the eastern China to live with fatherless Uyghur families, and to the extent of sharing the mother/wife's bed.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, and there are pictures now aplenty of Uyghurs with their hands tied behind their backs and their heads shaved, and the atrocities you hear about are just awful.
Yeah. It's pretty horrible stuff if true, and I think there's a lot of it's very credible.
Yeah. So.
And didn't Disney just catch a bunch of flack for filming the Mulan movie there in the same province where the Uyghur concentration camps are?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, we'll get into the Disney aspect of this in a little bit, but you bet.
What I want to do is pull us back to the theme, which is how should the United States approach relations to China, as far as economics go, as far as foreign policy goes. And I think we have to look through the lens of, are the pot and the kettle both black in this instance? It's not like the United States hasn't ever put an ethnic minority into concentration camps. And it's not like the United States hasn't been complicit in cleansing certain ethnic groups from certain areas, like our support of the Saudi situation in Yemen right now, our moves in Syria and things like that come to mind. And when you hear foreign ministers from China, or foreign dignitaries and foreign diplomats from China and from the United Kingdom and Europe, they bring this up all the time. Well, China's being a belligerent neighbor in the region. Yes, but we're partnered with the United States, the most belligerent of neighbors in any region. So, should we?
He's getting outside the Venn diagram.
Well, but it's. Yeah. I think that there's a substantiation to that. If we're going to have these types of situations, should we hold that against China in the regards of, are we going to keep an economic relationship, for one, right?
Yeah.
So we don't have to announce that what they're doing is right and it's acceptable, or we have to turn the other way just because we've done something similar. But should we decouple our economics, for example, or should we have a greater military presence in their region because of this thing?
Yeah. We didn't actually explain at the beginning of the show that probably most of you are longtime listeners, but we are ever going as a podcast, and so some of you may be first timers. And Clyde is a libertarian, and I'm a conservative. And there's a lot of Venn diagram overlap in our views of things, but there's some areas outside of it. And foreign policy is one. To be just with all due respect, Clyde, I don't see the United States committing anything on the level of the atrocities that the Uyghurs are suffering, or the heavy-handedness that is being exercised over Hong Kong.
Well, and currently they probably aren't. The United States probably isn't. You couldn't draw a direct parallel to the Uighur situation, but perhaps the Japanese internment camps in World War II would be brought up and are brought up often. So I think when people talk about China's economy, a lot of people on the right often say, well, China's in a phase of their economy that's younger than ours, in regards to their pollution, in regards to, their infrastructure, and they have to develop more. That was that was sort of the reason why they said, well, it's okay for them to pay low wages because they're developing still. So if they are still developing, then it's fair to draw the comparison to things that the United States did in the past.
Trail of Tears.
There you go.
Rick Jackson in 1824.
Not that I'm the biggest advocate of holding somebody's history against them forever.
Right.
But these things will and do get brought up, and it's hard to argue that.
Yeah, you got to be prepared to address it. But this Hong Kong thing, what the deal was there, Britain handed Hong Kong back over to China in 1997 with the understanding that Hong Kong would be allowed to proceed under a one nation, two systems arrangement. And it would continue to have a free market economy and representative democracy that wasn't just a facade for the Communist Party or anything like that. And things were going along pretty well until Xi Jinping became president up in Beijing, and extradition law made its way through the legislature in Hong Kong, which would allow mainland China to extradite people for certain kinds of crimes they've been charged with to be tried up in mainland China. And huge protests broke out in the summer of 2019. There were huge protests about this, and the people doing the protesting were quoting Thomas Jefferson and waving American flags and putting together paper mache models of the Statue of Liberty and so forth. And the law is going to go into effect, and we, there once again, what's the United States' role, as you were saying a little earlier? That's a whole sovereign nation thing. Do we have any business speaking out about that and trying to have any influence there? And what kind of influence would it be? Just pure diplomacy, send Mike Pompeo over to talk to the Chinese foreign minister, or would we, secretly aid the resistance, the protesters there in Hong Kong? What are you going to do in a situation like that? And these things arise on the world stage all the time, and this was a particularly glaring one. And I, like you were just saying about the previous issue, it's kind of a tough call if you're going to talk about a world made up of sovereign nation states.
And whenever decisions are made, contracts are contracts, for one. To some degree, they are just paper. So did anybody think that China was going to honor the one country, two systems thing? I find it really naive to think that that was going to be something that they were going to honor in perpetuity.
That leopard wasn't going to change its spots.
That's right. Well, I don't know. The Chinese spots might be capitalist. The Taiwanese, the Singapore, and Hong Kong, they're all ethnically Chinese. They're exceptional capitalists.
True.
And China was a major force before communism. Throughout their history, they were excellent at managing resources and obtaining resources, and had vast marketplaces. So I think it's in the Chinese nature. I think maybe in the human nature, but I think it's not within the Chinese nature to be communist necessarily. I heard some people saying something like, the Chinese are great capitalists. If it weren't for the mainland's setbacks of communism, they would be so much further along in their economic development than they are now. People are marveling at where China is economically now, and other scholars are saying, well, yeah, they're getting into a good place economically now, but they're about 60 years behind because they took this insane detour. Took their eyes off the prize. So
I do want to make sure we cover all these aspects of this overarching question of how should we frame our relationship with China. Speaking of capitalism, there's a very good article currently at the website for the Heritage Foundation, a think tank, called How China is Taking Control of Hollywood. And it brings in Tim Desher of the Heritage Foundation, brings in reporters from NBC's Today Show, Fox News. Stephen Colbert was part of the conversation, and a fellow named Mike Gonzalez. The transcript that you can listen to the podcast of it, and we'll link this. I sent it to you, didn't I, Clyde? And so we'll link this. But the conversation is just fascinating. China has 1.3 billion people, and the United States has less than a third of that. But the Chinese box office revenue is now about $8.6 billion. Once again, just like for a lot of like various manufactured products that with regarding to movies, how are you going to ignore that market? Chinese censors, you have to submit, if you're a Hollywood producer for a major Hollywood studio, Paramount or Universal or Warner Brothers or DreamWorks or whatever, to this huge market where you want theaters filled across China to watch your movie, you got to submit it to Chinese censors, and they can and will change your script, change your movie in order to portray China so as not to make it look like a dictatorship. And Doctor Strange, for instance, had a Tibetan character, and the studio that was making it had to change the Tibetan character to a Celtic character to satisfy the Chinese censors. And at the wrap.com, there's a November 2016 piece that I just found utterly fascinating. 12 Chinese-owned media companies, from Dick Clark Productions to AMC, which is the movie theater chain. Companies that have China, through its the various investment companies, has a significant stake in. Carmike Cinema's owner, Legendary Entertainment. Like I say, Dick Clark Productions. It's just incredible. I highly recommend that. And there's two things about this. One, there's a lot of bucks to be made for China's government/party. B, it's a great way to influence American culture, to have this censorship. And then let us.
Let's hold on before we leave that. Let's go back to American culture here really quickly, because what concerns me about Chinese influence in media productions in America isn't so much that if you want to show your movie in China, you've got to get it past the Chinese censors. What frightens me is that in order for you to show your movie in the United States, that you have to get your movie past the Chinese censors. You know what I mean? And so far, I don't know, and this may just be my own naivete, but I haven't heard of any examples of where China said you can't depict China in a certain way in the United States for an American audience, but you have to change your movie in order to show it in China. And I don't like censorship, but that seems reasonable in the way we do censorship already today. But then you can see examples of where our news media already do this, where they change the language to cast China in a more ingratiating light, so that they, when they talk about these situations with the Uighurs, or they talk about their movements in Hong Kong, they smooth over what's really going on, and they use kind words and language to make it sound like it's not as big a problem.
Yeah, I think this push for an ownership presence in these American entertainment companies is along those lines.
People are starting to realize that politics is downstream from culture.
Yeah.
Right. So if you influence the culture, then you influence the politics.
A huge part of American culture is sports, and I think the American public is starting to really reassess how much it loves sports because of this whole woke thing, the social justice grandstanding in the NBA, the NFL, hockey, tennis. There's a number of major league professional sports where people are just like, count me out, with all this taking a knee and slogans on the jerseys and helmets and all that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a writer, happens to be black, which is not completely irrelevant. Who great writer who writes for a sports site called Outkick.com, and Outkick's interesting. They generally take a much broader view than your average sports site of anything that an article's covering. And Jason Whitlock writes a lot about all this social justice push type stuff, but he also says you want to know what's going on with the real intense levels of this wokeness. Keep your eye on China. He says they've put the goals and agenda of China ahead of the American agenda, and that's why it's easy for them to sit on their thrones and smear America, while overlooking the fact that there is Asian slave labor and the Communist Party using a LeBron James or a Colin Kaepernick and a Nike to smear America. He said that recently on the Ingram Angle, which is a Fox News program, and you're not going to get very far without acknowledging that. The CEO of Nike recently said Nike is a brand of China for China. Once again, this huge market, people over there as well as over here, people over there where the Nike shoe apparel is made, like it too. And the revenue from the world's second largest economy surged by 27% during its most recent quarter. Parker gushed, coming off the FIBA World Cup in China, we were also excited about the energy around the basketball category in this geography and globally as we enter the new NBA season. He gushed about the 70% year-over-year growth in digital sales in China, calling it nothing short of extraordinary. Now, LeBron James, the Los Angeles Lakers player, who's got a lifetime endorsement deal with, let me back up. When things arise that don't please China, the muzzle goes on. Houston Rockets general manager Daryl Morey tweeted support for the pro-democracy protesters in Hong Kong. Nike, in response, pulled its Houston Rockets merchandise from 5 stores in Beijing and Shanghai. Now, LeBron James of the Los Angeles Lakers, who has a lifetime endorsement deal with Nike, said, Morey was misinformed about when he tweeted about the protest. LeBron James said, I'm not here to judge how the league handled the situation. I just think that when you're misinformed or you're not educated about something, and I'm just talking about the tweet itself, you never know the ramifications that can happen. I mean, he's towing the line too, big time, and that's quite clear what's going on there.
Well, you don't talk crap about your sponsors, right?
Right.
I don't know who sponsors who because I don't know sports, but you don't see the race car in and the guy who drives the Tide car, get out and be like, I love Arm & Hammer or whatever.
Right.
Tide sucks.
But all this, the sum total of all this is that we can see that China is really aggressively insinuating itself into America economically and culturally, and doing so for not only economic reasons to fill their coffers, but strategic reasons. China wants to be predominant on the world stage,
and not just the United States either, in Africa and the Middle East and all over the world, really.
Yeah, this Belt and Road Initiative, which they've gotten several African nations all excited about this. We'll develop your infrastructure. Let us into your country, and we'll develop your infrastructure. They've got, like I say, a lot of African nations excited. It's in Europe. At my blog, Late in the Day, which for any newcomers, I have a blog called Late in the Day, and I post quite frequently. And I also have a Substack newsletter called Precipice, which I'm for my longer, more essay-type pieces. A piece at Late in the Day the other day called 3 Major Situations Going On in the Middle East / Mediterranean, 1 encouraging and 2 that are jitters-worthy. And I'm not digressing too much because I'm going to bring China into this, but the one I found encouraging was these 2 recent peace agreements between Israel and certain Arab countries. The most recent being with Bahrain. Now, a few things about that. It's easier. The ironic thing is, and this will kind of, you'll be pleased about my viewpoint as a libertarian, because
Okay.
libertarian that you are. The West, particularly the United States, is arguably heavy-handed attempt to bring democracy to certain Arab countries that have had a hardcore tradition of a different sort. I think of Syria and Iraq as possibly the two biggest examples. Libya.
There's a disaster.
By golly, we can go in there and show them how to set up a representative democracy and free market, and they'll be once they see that these are great things, why, it'll just all start being so great. The irony is that it seems that these two peace deals are kind of indicative of shifting dynamics in the Middle East, and the best luck that the world is having with Israel achieving peace with countries is with countries that still have strong monarchies that going way back, and in the cases of both the UAE and Bahrain, that seems to be the way that's working out. But it is indeed working out, and I think for reasons Saudi Arabia just may be on tap as well. Who was it? Some country that has been kind of behind the scenes or under the table working with Israel is sending a representative to be present at the signing ceremony for this Israel Bahrain deal. But anyway, dynamics are shifting in the Middle East because a lot of these Sunni Arab countries have a common interest with Israel in countering Iran's designs, and that's encouraging. But there's two other situations that can kind of give one the jitters. One is Lebanon, and that's ironic because Lebanon, from the 1920s when it became an independent state, well, it was still kind of had ties to France, but became completely independent in 1943. During the first 3/4 of the 20th century, Beirut was known as the Paris of the Mediterranean, with broad tree-lined boulevards, and it was a banking and financial center, and everybody dressed fashionably, and it was very cosmopolitan, and all the different ethnic groups, the Druze, the Maronite Christians, the Sunnis, the Shiites, all mingled, and it was great. And then, of course, the Civil War that went from 1975 to 1990 just completely obliterated that, and the whole thing got real factionalized and so forth.
Well, I mean, it's hard to imagine that you have all this ethnic diversity and everything's going great, and then they had a civil war. Like, everything's not going great, and everyone's getting along famously, and then you have a civil war. That's not where civil wars come from.
No, it takes a while for these things to get to the boiling point.
Right.
Yeah. Okay. But since then, the ostensible government in Syria under the Assads has had considerable influence politically. Various jihadist groups such as Hezbollah and Hamas, particularly Hezbollah, it's a failed state at this point. Their economy is in the tank, and I guess COVID's running rampant over there these days. But the world ought to pay attention to what's happening in Lebanon. And then the third one was Greece and Turkey are squaring off in the Mediterranean over gas and oil interests, and they're both NATO members, but Turkey is establishing alliances with other countries outside of NATO, whereas Greece been recently doing joint military exercises, or Italy and Spain have been doing joint military exercises with Greece to kind of show that hand. And in all this, the last two things I mentioned, the situation in Lebanon, and then the situation between Greece and Turkey, China, with its Belt and Road Initiative, is in there doing what it can to exert influence. China has offered a lifeline of billions of dollars in aid and pledged to rebuild a vital infrastructure like the obliterated Beirut port. You remember that situation last month? That was weird. Who the heck thought that was a good idea to store all those tons of ammonium nitrate in a warehouse in that Beirut port? And blew up, and so as if Lebanon didn't have enough troubles. But China was right in there saying, "Let us help you rebuild," and
so like the nation state of ambulance chasers.
Yeah, well put, Clyde. China's on the move.
Yeah, I had read something about some of the stuff that they had done in Africa, and I don't have anything to substantiate this, but I had read that what they did was they would go in and sort of be a predatory lender and build all this infrastructure for these countries that could never possibly pay it back, and then eventually they just basically repossess the and annex it. Basically, they just repossess the infrastructure and the land, and it just becomes a Chinese interest rather than the country that had invested it and paid interest on it and all that kind of stuff. So it's funny how we talked about going into the Middle East and teaching them about economics and all that stuff, and we're going to turn every place into a liberal democracy with free market economics and all this kind of stuff. And didn't Milton Friedman go to China when it first opened up? And I have a feeling like they were just so interested in actually learning about leveraging the power of markets. I mean, they had the power to look around the world and see how markets improved global living standards. So I think Nixon and that group and Friedman expected China to learn about markets, see how it can lead to freedom, and see how it can lead to prosperity for everybody. And then, well, by God, they're just going to, start waving their American flags, and they're going to have their U.S. style Western democracy and open markets. And they leverage the powers of markets, but in this state capitalism way. They doubled down on their the control of the people and negating actual representative democracy, but still leveraged the power of markets. They did raise the living standards for a lot of people inside China while doing so, and continue to do so. And that's where you get some of the problems, because people don't care about the stuff that's going wrong when so much stuff is going right. They don't care that they can't use WhatsApp. They've got WeChat. They don't care that they can't use Google. They've got some alternative that when they put in the thing that they want to buy or what service they want to use, it returns the right result. And as long as their standard of living keeps going up, most people just aren't going to care that the government is doing bad things. Look at the United States. Like most of us don't even know who Julian Assange is. You know what I mean? Much less the fact that our government is persecuting the only source of non-fake news that we have. In the land of the First Amendment. But
there's one more aspect to this that we ought to touch on, and that's the environment. I'll just go ahead and state for the record, and it's no surprise to anybody who's read my stuff or heard previous Barney and Clyde shows. I think to a large extent the whole climate alarmism thing is a racket, and the idea that we have to, with great urgency, abandon all human advancement because the oceans are rising or something like that is ill-advised, to say the least. But anyway, we've had all these, the Rio de Janeiro Accord and the Stockholm Agreement, or Oslo, and then the Paris Accord, and all the countries in the world are supposed to sign on to it and everything. And the United States caught great flack a couple of years ago for withdrawing from that. But China, by golly, China's still on board. Well, no, they continue to build coal-fired power plants in their own country that go in the opposite direction of the parts per million goals of the Paris Climate Accord. They are also doing that with all this help to the countries that are partnering with them in the Belt and Road Initiative. In Europe, they're building coal-fired power plants that are, if you're into that sort of thing, the Paris Climate Accord agreements, that's running in the counter direction, and China's not a good faith partner for things like that. I just wanted to make sure that was pointed out. So the question then, the overarching question we're dealing with here, how do you see it, Chad? You got a strong viewpoint one way or the other about how we should proceed in our relationship with China?
Going back to the climate accords, just super fast. Yeah, I think that it's an interesting situation when people lost their minds when Trump said we're not going to do this again. We're not going to sign the Paris Climate Agreement.
For my money, I'm no Trumpist, but I think that was one of his good moves.
And I agree. I think he kind of did it to be divisive and to light a lot of liberal hair on fire, which I can also respect. But he basically said, well, China and India and these other places, even if they sign it, they're not going to hold it up. They're not. It's a non-binding agreement. There's no penalty for not meeting the regulations, or they're not regulations. They're just guidelines. It's an agreement.
Yeah.
But there's no penalty attached. But the United States is going to pay the price in what we call it, reputation, if we were to sign the Paris Climate Accords and then not live up to the tenets of it, right? So China's kind of being like, well, whatever, we'll just sign it to have the face, to save the face, and then we'll just do whatever we want instead, which kind of seems to be, their MO so far.
Yeah. What's your viewpoint on how we should proceed
overall? Well, I'm not a diplomat, I'm not somebody who's.
I would have known that about you, Clyde.
I'm just saying, like, I'm not qualified to say how the United States at large should interact with China, but I will say that I have met a lot of Chinese people over the course of my life and the course of my career, and I have to say that I have never met anyone from China who wasn't immensely helpful, very kind, extremely smart.
Yeah.
It just fuels my distrust and distaste for government at large, because I know so many individuals that prove that individuals, by and large, are good. There's a lot of good souls in the world, and there are a lot of good souls in China, and I think that maybe some of the wrong ones have the power, but I think if you gave people the freedom to interact with one another, if you actually had free markets, if you actually had free people, that they would mostly interact with each other in a peaceful manner.
Well put. You wrap things up on a very nice libertarian note there, Clyde, and actually you make even a broader point, which is that demographic classifications ultimately don't paint the full picture of any individual human being in this world, and demographic classifications or classification by citizenship or anything. Yeah. You're not going to.
I agree. I agree with you that I'm right.
Yeah. Okay.
Did we solve the problem? What's your take on how can you frame a relationship with China?
Well, I think some of this is there's obviously there's some things. I'm going to see a few things differently than you. I think a strong naval presence in the South Pacific is a good idea. I'm pretty sure you don't. But with regard to,
I think it's fine anywhere we've been invited or any territory that we own.
Okay, all right. Anyway, but with regard to the private sector, all these immense, vast American companies and with well entrenched supply chains, I I just have a feeling they're now reassessing all that and saying, oh, boy, you know, China, maybe it's maybe on not even on just a moral level, but a pragmatic level, it's not worth us to be so darn in bed with them, and
Yeah.
let's go looking for vendors elsewhere.
Well, that makes sense to a certain degree. Look at, again, draw it back to Yemen. You know, Yemen sort of decoupled their food supply, or sort of decoupled their productivity inside their country from being agrarian, and stopped producing most of their own food, and now they're suffering a blockade and it's starving them. So
Yeah.
maybe so I think people should interoperate with each other and trade with each other, but at the same time, it probably would behoove us to remember how to make things ourselves.
Yeah, yeah, and not bring the heavy hand of government into it with some kind of protectionist policy and industrial policy. No, but I just get the message out that it, like you were saying, it behooves us to remember how to make things.
So is there a way that the United States, who is sometimes a moral actor and sometimes not,
Okay.
is there a way for the United States to have a moral relationship with China, who is also, in some cases, not acting morally as we see it?
Yeah. Boy, I'm increasingly thinking that that's difficult to do, to have a relation. We just like we did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, we got to have embassies in each other's countries and exchange ambassadors and all that good stuff. But beyond that, I think that the day and age of all the exchanges is past now.
Yeah. I just don't know. It seems like decoupling something so entrenched just seems like an impossible task, you know?
We sure did, yeah. We built up quite a relationship over the last 30 or 40 plus years, yeah.
But at the same time, it's amazing to see how quickly plants and industries tool up and change direction, and they've got things ready to go in Brazil and South Korea and Malaysia, and you know, they're ready to bring on the business. So maybe it's not as impossible as it would seem. But yeah, there's a lot of reasons to do it. There's all the intellectual property theft that
we didn't really get into.
Which, in fairness, I think the times that's been brought up and people have actually filed complaints with the World Trade Organization that China's complied and made the changes, but you know, they're definitely a repeat offender.
Well, that's a look at China from the BNC perspective.
So here's the next thing. Tell us what you think. Tell us how do you think that the United States and the West at large can go forward having a prosperous relationship with China. What concessions does China have to make? What concessions does the U.S. have to make? Is it possible at all? Do we need to decouple? What would that look like? What's your opinion? What do you think? And what have you been reading?
Yeah, so chime in. Several ways to chime in with us. In the comment thread under this post at Facebook or YouTube. You can email us.
Yeah.
What's it? Yeah.
The YouTube comments would be preferred.
Okay.
Comments on Facebook would be facebook.com/Barney and Clyde Show would be a close second. But you can also send us an email, barneyandclydeshow@gmail.com. Or if you are a Patreon subscriber, which you can do at patreon.com/Barney and Clyde, just put Patreon in the subject of your email, and it'll go straight to the top of our 6 emails in our inbox.
Okay.
Okay.
Well, thanks for joining us for this hour of discussion, everybody. We greatly appreciate your helping us build a community here.
Yeah, it's been a real blast as always.
And until we meet again, stay vigilant about your freedom.
I agree with you that I'm right.